Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending when you are. My name is Diego Groiso. I am one of the organizers of today's virtual conversation with Professor Michele de Nevers, Executive Director of Sustainability Programs at the Haas School of Business. I am an alumnus of Haas about 20 years ago, but still an alumnus and chair of the UC Alumni UK Sustainability Committee. Tonight's conversation is the second in what we hope will be a series of talks between UC faculty and UC alumni community in Europe. We're extremely grateful to Michele de Nevers for agreeing to speak to us about herself and her work. Michele will tell us about herself in a few minutes, but before she does, it would be great for her if we can introduce ourselves. Just give us a name and what you do, what's your expertise, and why you're here. Very short, so we can quickly move into the part of the conversation. Matthew, you want to start?
Sure. I'm Matthew. I'm an alumnus of UC Davis, and I've been working for the University of California Trust for about 23 years now, but it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the session tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Just without any order of priority, just looking at the list of who's on the Zoom. Julie, you want to present yourself?
Sure. My name's Julie Wyrick, and I was actually invited by Sarah Adams, who may be an alumni, and I am an ESG consultant.
All right, excellent. We have Sonia. You are on mute if you are trying to speak. Maybe not. Let's see, Conrad. You're on mute. I think he was the one on the tube. Ashley.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm a UC Santa Barbara grad, and I'm head of project management at a KCM group, and we're a global healthcare solutions provider. And we have just launched a massive ESG program across the group. So Matthew was kind enough to invite me. Thank you.
All right. Carlos.
I'm Carlos Coleman Meissner. I'm alumni from UC Davis. My background is in engineering, and I'm supporting Diego as a co-chair or in this committee. So welcome. I'm very interested to know more about the business of sustainability and circular economy, because it's a kind of very broad area, covering even engineering, optimization, which is my main background, because optimization is very important for the industrial process, and also the integration of things or systems that are part of that very complex and intrinsic system that represent the economy and our life, day life, and things are welcome. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Callahan, a Haas alumni. I was co-president of the UK chapter for 6 years. I'm based in Spain now and working on startups.
All right, thank you. Adriana?
Yeah, hi, I'm Michele. I'm working in Berkeley, and I just graduated last December from Haas.
Congratulations.
I am, yeah, thank you. And we are forming the Haas Alumni Sustainability Club for Haas, so I would like to connect with you two later on as well.
Yeah,
So
excellent.
getting into chemical engineer, getting into climate business.
All right, thank you. And I think Romy.
Hi, I'm Romy. I am the communications officer at the UC Trust UK, and I'm interested in sustainability, so I'm looking forward to being part of this discussion.
All right, thank you very much. Have I missed anybody?
Christina Matey.
Oh, Christina, yes.
Hello, everybody. I'm Christina, and I actually just found out about this group. I'm from Los Angeles, but I just moved to Paris in August, and I'm working for a sustainable consulting firm. I am running partnerships and business development in EMEA, and I'm very excited to be part of this conversation today.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Oh, and I'm from the UCLA campus.
All right. Thank you. So
Diego, Sonia's resurfaced. Does she want to say?
Sonia, excellent. Yes.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Sonia from UC Riverside, and yeah, really interested in sustainability. I'm an ESG assurance and reporting manager at KPMG, and so do a lot of auditing of ESG information from corporates and what the new landscape is on regulations. So really interested in the topic. And thanks for having it. Excellent.
All right. Thank you. So to make this webinar as interactive as possible, we have determined like a round robin format. We have selected some random participants and assigned them some questions to kick the conversation around the topics that we want to discuss. I have shared an email early with those people. I'm going to put them on the chat anyhow. And I will call on your name when that question comes. But the idea is that we kick a topic and then we can have a conversation around that topic. So 2 or 3 follow-up questions will be great. That's the idea. Let's see where it goes. And to enable everybody to get on their next meeting and hopefully celebrate Valentine's, we will aim to wrap up about these 5 minutes before the top of the hour. Is that okay with everybody? Cool, let's go. So, Michele, if you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, how do you get where you are today, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Diego. Just one question before we start. What is the UC Trust?
The University of California Trust. It's it's a corporation and a 501c3 that's based in London, that's set up by the University of California Office of the President. It was created in 1999, and it has a student support program, an alumni program, and it's got a system-wide remit and a philanthropy program, and we work with academics on activities like this, if that's helpful.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you, Diego, for organizing this. Diego had asked me, and sorry, I'm just getting over COVID, so I have a little bit of a cough. Diego had asked me to talk about climate change and carbon markets, so I had thought about doing that, but I'm happy to talk about whatever you all are interested in. Sounds like several of you are interested in ESG kinds of things. In terms of my background, I was a Berkeley undergraduate. I majored in bacteriology while I was here. I also did a junior year abroad in Spain. In those days, it was a year abroad. After I graduated, I went to the Peace Corps in the Philippines for 2 years. Then I went to graduate school and did a master's in management at MIT Sloan. And then I worked at the World Bank for 30 years in development, obviously, and most of that was in environment and climate change areas with developing countries. After I left the World Bank, I worked in a think tank in Washington called the Center for Global Development, and I worked on REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And then I taught in a graduate program at Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona for a couple of years before I came to Haas, where I came here 2 years ago because the dean, Ann Harrison, has a goal of making Berkeley the #1 business school in the area of sustainability, and so she wanted somebody to help her to roll that out. And so that's my job. That's what I'm doing now.
Excellent. Thank you. Matthew.
Hi, Michele. Could you tell us a little bit about carbon markets and how you think they're doing as a mechanism for solving some of the problems facing us.
Okay, so in order to talk about carbon markets, I do want to give a little bit of background about climate change, because it's important to what the role of carbon markets is. So just very quickly, maybe, if it works, yes. Okay, so you all know that global temperatures have been rising over the last, sort of 50 years. It's not unusual. We've had periods of ice ages and tropical climates for the last 800,000 or so years. But at this point, temperatures are rising over the 20th and 21st centuries more sharply and more rapidly than in the past. At the same time, we see that carbon dioxide is rising. The current level is higher than it's been in more than 1 million years. The reason I show those separately is because it looks pretty clear that they're very highly correlated, but the relationship is nonlinear and complex, and it's something that scientists are still spending a lot of time working on. The largest greenhouse gas by volume is carbon dioxide. The next largest is methane. So carbon markets tend to target those two gases. The thing that's most important for thinking about carbon markets is, does it matter where greenhouse gases are produced? Does anybody want to answer that question? Okay, the answer is no. It does not matter where greenhouse gases are produced because of something that's called atmospheric mixing. So whether or not emissions come from a factory in China or cars in California or London, they all go into the atmosphere and then get mixed across the globe. And that is very important because that is the reason that people think that carbon markets can be an effective tool. A word about the Paris Agreement. I'm sure you all know that in 2015, 192 countries under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed to a global treaty to try to hold the increase in global average temperature to no more than 2 degrees above the baseline. And the baseline is broadly the pre-industrial average temperature before we started burning fossil fuels for energy. So they agreed on a target of holding the increase to 2 degrees. They also agreed to make every effort to hold the increase in global average temperature above pre-industrial levels to 1.5 degrees. So you'll hear a lot about 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. Where are we now? Well, where we are now is not a pretty picture. This is the historical trend of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These two areas here, the blue and the red, are what the trajectory of emissions, carbon emissions, would need to be to keep us within the Paris targets. The purple shows what the pledges that were made at Paris and more recently in Glasgow would lead us to. So they would lead us to an increase in global average temperatures of between 2.6 and 3.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages. So we are not on track to achieve the 1.5 or 2 degree targets. So how can carbon markets help? So there's two kinds of carbon markets, and this is important to know. There are voluntary carbon markets and what's called compliance carbon markets. And then we'll talk about offsets. Compliance carbon markets are programs like the California Cap and Trade Program or the EU European Trading System, ETS, which many of you should be familiar with. What happens in a compliance market is a government imposes a cap on a company and says, you're only allowed, okay, let's look at this one. You're only allowed to emit this amount of carbon emissions, and you're not allowed to emit more than that. So the company has two choices. They can change their technology or change their processes or do whatever it takes to bring their emissions down to stay within this cap. Or with carbon markets, they can pay somebody else to do that for them. So if this company, the red on the left, is able to keep its emissions below the level of the cap set by the government, then they have a little bit of spare space of emissions that they can sell to this other company that for whom it would be very expensive to reduce emissions. So the purpose of carbon markets is to reduce the cost of reducing emissions, to try to find the least cost ways to achieve the global target of emissions and to hold the emissions within the cap that would be needed to achieve the 1.5 or 2 degree targets. And so this carbon markets are a way to do this more cheaply than just shutting down companies or forcing them to put in place very expensive technologies to reduce their emissions. If another company can do it more cheaply, they can buy the credits from that company. Okay, so those are compliance markets. The other kind of markets are voluntary markets. And this is where you hear a lot about offsets. Okay, I see these questions here. Oh. Yeah, okay. More than okay. This is, I'm looking at Diego's question about 90% of rainforest carbon offsets being worthless.
No, ignore them for now.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. And I also see Barbara Haya is on our call and she runs the—
No. That was a question I wanted to ask you later.
Okay, all right, we'll come back to that. All right, so voluntary carbon markets, and this is where the controversy lies. So what happens is a lot of companies that are not necessarily subject to compliance carbon markets that are either not in California or not in Europe or not in a market where there is a regulatory cap on their emissions, they may choose to reduce emissions because they think it's a good thing to do. There are many different reasons that companies choose to do this. And as you know, many companies have voluntarily adopted net zero targets, where they, on their own, agree to reduce their emissions of their operations, whether it's scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3, to zero by some date, usually by 2050. Again, in voluntary markets, as in compliance markets, they can either do this within their own firm and their own processes and their own productions, or they can buy credits from somebody else who is able to reduce emissions or remove carbon from the atmosphere more cheaply than they can. And so they can pay money for somebody else to do it. So when voluntary market participants buy emission reductions outside of their firm, those emission reductions are called offsets because they're offsetting their own emissions outside of the location of their company. And it just basically means you're reducing, somebody else is reducing emissions at a different location than your own company's production. And you can pay for that emission reduction credit. So each credit corresponds to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or carbon that's either avoided or removed from the atmosphere. And that can be used by a company to compensate for a ton of emissions that they are still emitting. When a credit is used for that purpose, it becomes an offset. And generally what happens is the offset is registered and set aside and taken out of trading and it's no longer tradable, so that emission reduction becomes permanent. Carbon, just companies can participate individually or groups of companies, in the case of airlines and shipping, can have gotten together and set targets for reducing emissions as a group. Carbon offsets is a shorthand for emission reductions or removals that compensate for a company's own emissions. And the offset credit is an instrument that is certified either by a government or by an independent certification body to represent an emission reduction of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent amount of greenhouse gases. And when those of you who have talked about working on ESG investments, one of the issues with ESG is that these independent certification bodies are not regulated. There's not a standard set by governments that everyone agrees to for them. So there are many different standards, and that causes a bit of confusion in ESG and in carbon markets. In the voluntary market, the way that emission offsets work is basically when you buy an offset or your company buys an offset, you're investing in a project that is trying to reduce emissions. So you have your emissions, you make an investment for an offset project. The offset project might be building solar panels somewhere instead of using fossil fuel energy. Then you have an organization that quantifies the emission reduction that takes place as a result of this project. And then the offsetter retires the carbon credit on your behalf. So that's schematically how the project works. The kinds of projects that are found in voluntary carbon markets are, as you can see, a lot of them have to do with forestry and land use. Also renewable energy, and less, but there still are some having to do with waste disposal, household devices, etc. But there's a lot in the forestry and land use sector, and that's what leads to the kinds of controversies that I guess Paul and Diego have been asking about.
Yes.
This just shows that carbon markets are taking off globally. The red areas in this picture show where there are carbon taxes. So there are carbon taxes in some parts of Canada and Argentina, etc. The blue areas show where there is a different mechanism for putting a price on carbon, which is a carbon market, which is a cap and trade program. So you have the EU cap and trade program. China now has a nationwide cap and trade program. California has a cap and trade program. And Canada has several cap and trade programs, which are linked to California's program. So how do you want to go from here, Diego? Do you want me to answer the questions that are in the chat, or do you want to have?
So I was going to ask you the question. So the first question that comes to mind when looking at this picture is what happened with the US? Why there is nothing in the US except California? It's just you know.
Yeah, the US. Okay. There are a couple of, there's California, and then you can see here is RGGI, which is a regional greenhouse gas emission reduction program in New York and New England. It only applies to greenhouse gas emissions from electricity, but they do have a carbon trading program and targets for reducing emissions. What happens in the rest of the US is that there was a proposal for a nationwide cap and trade program at the time of the Copenhagen COP in 2009, and it got turned down in the Congress. So we have been unable in the US to pass legislation that would lead to the creation of a nationwide cap and trade program. There are other cap and trade programs under development in Washington and Oregon and some other states. There are, that's about it, basically.
Okay.
So it's political, purely political.
Okay. Okay. Sad to hear, but thank you for
Sad
the
to hear.
reality.
Very sad to hear. Yes.
So the key question for me, and I promise I open the floor for everybody to ask questions afterwards, is there was an article here in Europe not long ago, a few weeks back, from The Guardian, talking about all the bad things that carbon credits are, which are not trusted, that a billion pounds worth of carbon credits are worthless. And if you read the details, there's different methodologies, and they're arguing about how to calculate the forecast of the greenhouse avoided. So for people like me, which are not experts and not professionals, and maybe we fly and we want to buy credits, or we are working in a company and we hear about carbon credits, how do we deal with that? What can we do? Can we trust this information? Can we trust The Guardian? Can we trust the companies, organizations like Vera, the certifies? If is the science not clear enough, or is the science right and we are just ignoring the science? What can we do about it?
Yeah. Okay. It's complicated, but
Okay.
so the way offsets work is you need an offset project needs to say, okay, if this project did not happen, the emissions that would have happened would look like this. Emissions would have been a certain amount, let's say 20 gigatons. With our project, we're going to reduce emissions to 10 gigatons. So that reduction in emissions, of however it is, whether it's solar panels or reducing deforestation, you'd count that amount of reduction in emissions compared to a baseline, and then you can issue a credit for it. So what gets complicated is what's the baseline? And the baseline is what would have happened without this project. So let's take the case of deforestation, which is what the Guardian article was referring to. In the case of deforestation, it's complicated, but we now have good satellite imagery. A lot of deforestation projects, voluntary projects, take place in the tropics. And the reason is because tropical forests hold much more carbon than temperate forests. But in the California Cap and Trade Program, there are also domestic projects to reduce deforestation. Those tend to happen in the northwestern part of California, you know, where the big redwood groves are. So in the case of this Vera project that everyone points to when they say that offsets are a terrible thing, the measurement of how much carbon is captured in these standing trees, that measurement was taken in a range of, in a forest area in the first range of the coastal mountains of California. But then the area where the project took place was further inland. And the criticism is that those trees that are further inland don't absorb as much carbon as the trees on the coast where the carbon absorption was measured. So they think that the project is overstating the amount of carbon dioxide that is absorbed and retained by those trees. So it's complicated. More broadly, the reason that there are many criticisms of offsets and carbon trading in general. There's one school of critics that criticize carbon offsets because they say it lets companies off the hook from reducing emissions internally, okay? So they say, you know, let's say Chevron, the refinery, should reduce more emissions at the refinery here in Richmond and not be able to buy offsets to count as an emission reduction for whatever target they've adopted, which is not very ambitious anyway, but they do have some targets. So that's a kind of philosophical criticism of carbon markets and offsets that many people think reductions should take place in the company that is emitting, or the company should shut down. So obviously, in the case of coal-fired power plants, there's a lot of pressure to just shut them down. Economists tend to favor carbon markets because it allows, from a global and societal perspective, to reduce emissions in a more cost-effective way than if every company did it themselves or shut down. And so the societal benefit from doing it more cheaply is larger because you could take that amount of money saved and reduce more emissions somewhere else. So that's why economists favor carbon markets as a cost-effective tool to reduce emissions. So that's really kind of a philosophical argument. You know, you either think that companies should be forced to either close down or reduce emissions at the source, or, you know, or you think we should be able to reduce emissions where it is the cheapest. It's also the case in the case of forest projects, particularly in the tropics, that a couple of things. One is reducing deforestation, keeping existing tropical forests or whatever kind of forest standing, is more effective in terms of the carbon emissions savings than planting new trees. When you plant new trees, it takes the number of years that it takes the trees to grow to maturity to capture out of the atmosphere the carbon that is reduced in one afternoon from cutting down a mature forest to plant palm oil, for instance, in Indonesia. So reducing deforestation is a very effective tool for reducing emissions. And in fact, emissions from deforestation of tropical forests, if tropical forests were a country, that would be the third largest source of emissions in the world after China and the US, before the EU. So it's controversial because people think you shouldn't be able to do it at all. There are also issues, particularly in the tropics, with land grabs, with people buying land from, let's say, indigenous populations in order to capture the carbon credits. So there are a number of issues with forest carbon credits. They are manageable, but it's complicated. And so if you are not one that likes to countenance complexity, the easiest thing is to just throw it out the window. Now, coming back to the question of Verra, which is a company that certifies carbon credits. This is an issue that applies to carbon credits, and it applies to ESG, green bonds, all of these kinds of initiatives, which is that the standards that these companies adopt, that they use to certify the offsets or the credits or the ESG actions, are not regulated. They're not regulated by a government agency that you might have confidence, you know, will impose some uniform standards across all. So in ESG reporting, companies adopt their own definition of what constitutes ESG, or ESG certification agencies adopt their own standards, which is why you might find ESG funds that include fossil fuel investments, because companies are maybe putting in place solar panels. So that is a generic issue for both offset credits and ESG markets.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the group?
Yes, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the US legislation for tax incentives for green energy. And some of the comments in the European press have assessed that disrupts the EU approach, what they built up on focusing on trading emissions. And now it's forcing them to respond to look at tax incentives about how to address this, as there's a potential imbalance and examples in the UK of businesses leaving in order to go to the US because it's a better investing environment. So how do these green tax incentives impact this construct from your perspective?
It's actually, I think, quite interesting because many countries, particularly in the EU, have criticized the US for years for not taking measures to reduce emissions more aggressively. And as I mentioned earlier, the US tried to introduce a cap and trade program like the EU ETS, but it was not able. That's considered, in terms of carrots and sticks, regulatory carrots and sticks, the cap and trade program is a stick. You are told how much you have to reduce your emissions. That was not politically palatable in the US, so it didn't happen. So the Biden administration went for the other approach, which was to offer carrots, which is tax incentives. So for years, the EU has been criticizing the US for not doing enough. And when the US finally did something, now they're criticizing the US because it's a subsidy instead of the cap and trade program. But they're kind of working that out at this point. Paul, you wanted to say something? Okay. Anyway, so that is the criticism. And if they're claiming that it's not fair under the World Trade Organization rules, and if that's the case, then they will work it out through the World Trade Organization. But I don't know, my view is that if the US can do anything to reduce emissions, let them do it.
And do you have any view as to whether carrots or sticks are more effective, or?
Economists have lots of views about that. Economists would say the first best tool is a carbon tax, because it just is a price mechanism and it affects markets and it would lead to the most cost-effective solution. But as you all know, the US was founded on an anti-tax platform when we revolted against the UK for taxing tea. So tax is a bad word in the US, and that's why they've gone to this subsidy approach. I think every country's different in terms of what politically it will tolerate and what politically it will allow their governments to introduce. The EU is generally just a more cooperative and has more tolerance for government regulations in many areas than the US does. So I think every country has to deal with their own political reality. China, can do what it wants because it has a more authoritarian regime. And they've chosen to go the cap and trade route rather than the tax route. I know that the EU is talking about what's called border tax adjustments. And that would mean that if something were produced in a country where the price of carbon was not either taxed or subject to a cap and trade program like in the EU, that the EU could impose a tax when they import goods from that country. So every area is looking at different ways to solve this problem.
Thank you. Any other question?
Yeah, I've got a question. I mean, so Michele, I think I've got two questions. One, the first question is, do you think that the offsetting really has any future at all? Your comments sort of suggest you don't think that. And then there was another question that I saw in the chat that I thought was interesting, and I'm not sure who's meant to ask it, but do you see any alternatives to this, or do you think a sort of more heavyweight a cap, a sort of more sticks and more regulated environments the best solution?
Yeah, that related to the question from the comment from Barbara Hayes, that's saying that the offset market is broken. We need something else. Is there something else?
Yeah. Well, I think there are many different schools of thought on this question. I worked in the World Bank for 30 years, which is an organization with more than 3,000 PhD economists. So you kind of get this economic, mindset infiltrated into you, which looks at cost effectiveness. And I also spent 8 years working on trying to promote reducing emissions from reduced deforestation and forest degradation. So I like to think that offsets could be an effective tool because it's cost effective, and because in the case of forest offsets, providing money to keep tropical forests standing not only has carbon benefits, but it has a lot of other benefits in terms of biodiversity and protection of indigenous communities, etc. So I would hope that offsets can be an instrument, because the alternatives are either things like a carbon tax or cap and trade program within a government regulated limit. And those are politically very difficult in a place like the United States and many other countries. Or there just are not cost-effective alternatives that I'm aware of that have been tried. So I like to think that offsets will survive, but I don't know if they will. We'll see. I just haven't heard of other, voluntary companies. You have heard, so in Glasgow, a lot of companies announced net zero targets, but most of those rely on buying offsets. Few companies, Microsoft is one. And if you look at Microsoft's pledge, Microsoft has pledged to achieve net zero in its own internal operations, not by buying offsets. And that means basically finding renewable energy for all the data centers that are used in Microsoft's operations. So they originally were big buyers of offsets, but a couple of years ago, they sort of came to this recognition that, okay, we're going to do it internally and reduce to net zero. Not very many companies have done that. Within the UC system, UC Merced, which is the newest campus of the University of California system, they have a net zero target, and then they are net zero already, but 40% of their ability to be net zero is from buying offsets. So it will be, I think that progress towards achieving net zero will be slower if we don't have the offset instruments. But then again, ultimately getting to net zero means net zero. And so that means you either have to reduce your emissions to zero in absolute terms, or you need to find some instrument, whether it's carbon capture, utilization and storage, or reducing deforestation or other nature-based solutions that actually capture greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. That's what net zero means.
Thank you. Sonia, you have your hands up.
Yeah, thank you. Super interesting to hear about assuming that everyone's comfortable with offsets. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the kind of assurance and verification around offsets, since that's not, ESG in itself is not regulated for most indicators and types of reports that are coming out, and that's a challenge on itself. But then, working in sort of the accounting world, the prospect of having to assure and verify a future, like a forward statement, let alone a forward quantification of what carbon they're going to be able to capture over time, and how well preserved a forest will be, or how well the trees will grow if there's kind of a reforestation project. These are, being able to assure that is very challenging and difficult, but I was wondering if there are any kind of World Bank projects are, what's your comfort level with the RED program in terms of that assurance and kind of forward statements? Like, where has it worked?
Yeah. There actually are a bunch of World Bank programs on reducing deforestation. There's the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility and other carbon market programs that are run by the World Bank. I think a friend of mine was, until recently, the chief climate counselor for Janet Yellen in the Treasury. And he said they have people coming into their office every week saying, you, government, have to tell us, what does it mean to be net zero? What does it mean to be Paris compliant? What does it mean to be SDG compliant? So there is a desire for the government to set some standards and be the agency, I guess, that determines and enforces standards. And I think both in the case of ESG definitions and reporting, and in the case of things like offsets, it would be really helpful if governments did that. So maybe, California does it itself in its own cap and trade program, but that only applies to California. And some of the criticisms that were cited earlier actually are relevant to the forest offsets in the California cap and trade program. There are ways, there are methodologies that could be adopted to try to address some of the criticisms of these things. One would be not fully counting the amount of carbon reduction that forests are deemed to be responsible for, saying, okay, the estimates are that this forest can absorb 100 tons of carbon, but will only credit you 50 tons or 40 tons, something like that, so that you have a buffer just in case those trees have not reduced emissions by the amount that scientists estimate that they do. So there are ways to accommodate it through methodology. And these carbon markets, I mean, they're complicated. The California Air Resources Board that runs the cap and trade program, it's a complicated business. They have a lot of scientists working on that stuff. So I'm just looking at the questions in the chat. Adriana, I don't know about this quantitative easing from central banks. I've heard mention of it in terms of the IMF, but I don't really know enough about it to say.
And there is a question from Conrad as well. And then I'm going to move us to what's happening at Haas. But Conrad.
Yeah, just a real quick one. Michele, thank you for describing really clearly the carbon markets. And you did talk about nature-based solutions and referred to some of these emerging problems around the biodiversity impact of carbon projects or perceived biodiversity impact. Also, obviously, at Glasgow, there was a lot of aligning of the two objectives of carbon reduction and biodiversity preservation. I wonder if you have any views on the prospects of a biodiversity credit market being of the scale that we currently have for carbon. And also, as a sort of supplementary, very techie question, I wonder if you've got a go-to location where you get data on the size of the carbon market. This is a sort of Haas business question rather than the economist's question. Where do we make the money whilst we change the world?
Yeah. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is voluntary carbon markets are much smaller than compliance markets. So the compliance markets are the biggest carbon markets, and the voluntary markets are about 10% of compliance markets. So until now, compliance markets like the EU ETS in California and China are where most of the reduction is taking place. The biodiversity credits, I think that these biodiversity credits are going to end up being subject to the same kinds of concerns and criticism that forest offsets are already subject to, which have to do with setting baselines, measuring carbon absorption, etc., permanence. There are a lot of technical issues, and I think that that will affect biodiversity credits, but it would be interesting to, essentially what it's saying is, okay, if you maintain tropical forests, not only is there a carbon value in doing that, but there are biodiversity values. But how do you set a price on biodiversity? You can set a price on carbon because there are carbon prices in these markets, which tend to be very low, by the way. And the price of credits in the voluntary markets is also much lower than in the compliance markets, which are low enough to begin with. So there is a long way to go on all of this. But, anything that can be done to preserve forests will help to protect biodiversity. So if there are ways to get this going, that could be helpful.
So thank you. I think I was too optimistic with all the topics I wanted to cover in just 1 hour. So we have only 10 minutes left, and I wanted to leave a few minutes to know about what's happening at Haas. How are we training future leaders? What are the different sustainability initiatives? Is there things that we as alumni can we get involved? Is there anything we can do to help sustainability to progress in these topics?
The answer is yes, and maybe Adriana can tell us a little bit about it since she's working on setting up the sustainability affinity group and alumni. But very quickly, the Dean and Harrison is very committed to sustainability, and we have a goal that every student who graduates from Haas will have some basic literacy in sustainability issues and challenges and frameworks when they graduate. Beyond that, so what we're doing for that is we are working, and Adriana was actually working with us to help this, to try to incorporate sustainability topics and issues into all of the core courses that all Haas students are required to take. I think there's about 14 of them. And beyond that, they can take different electives, but if they only take electives, not related to sustainability, they should have encountered some sustainability content in the core. As of now, about 45% of the faculty who teach the core courses have introduced sustainability into their classes. So we're working with them one by one slowly to get that going. Beyond that, for students who are interested in more awareness and knowledge about sustainability, we introduced last year a graduate certificate in sustainable business. And Adriana, you got that, right? Yes, so Adriana got that. It requires taking 9 credits in from the electives that deal with sustainability, and there are about 25 of those electives. And then beyond that, for students who are really interested in going deeper, we are collaborating with the College of Natural Resources to introduce a dual degree program. They are setting up a professional master's degree in Masters of Climate Solutions, and we will combine that with an MBA, and so that students, it's a 1-year master's program, but you can combine it with the MBA and in 2.5 years get both an MBA and a master's in climate solution. We're hoping that that will launch in the fall of 2024. It's still making its way through the UC system of clearances, but we're hoping that will go ahead. Within the set of electives that are available to be taken and are part of the graduate certificate program in sustainable business, what we have at Haas is we have curriculum in a wide range of areas compared to other business schools. Other business schools, several of them, they partner with their schools of environment, and so students can take classes at the School of Environment or at the business school. But at Haas, we have, even within the business school, we have curriculum in energy and climate change through our Energy Institute at Haas. We have curriculum in sustainable finance, sustainable and impact finance. We have the Sustainable and Impact Finance Initiative. We have sustainable built environment courses through the Fisher Center on Real Estate and Urban Economics. They're really incorporating sustainability throughout the whole curriculum. We have a sustainable food program that is very popular and is in collaboration with the Berkeley Food Institute. And we have in the Center for Responsible Business programs on corporate social responsibility and corporate accountability. They're developing a program on reimagining capitalism. So we have already a wide range of electives that students can take in the area of sustainability. We are working to raise money for more faculty doing research in sustainability areas and publishing more papers on sustainability. We're trying to increase student internships and consulting assignments in sustainability. So those are just some of the things we're doing. Adriana, do you want to add to what I've said?
I think you summarized it very well. Just one thing to add, we're starting the Alumni Sustainability Affinity Club, and on that end, we're currently looking for like what is the alumni group of people looking for in terms of connecting with Haas. So we're kind of like getting a voice of the customer. What are we looking for? Is it a basic course? Is it like in detail, like in-depth interactions? Is it like conversations and beyond like the connection and forming a community itself? So that's something that we're kind of like brainstorming on right now, and we are planning to kick it off during the alumni reunion coming up. So that's something that is kind of like coming along. But yeah, the certificate has been an amazing add-on for me in particular, like diving towards the climate specific and going from the chemical the world. It has been like opening my eyes into like, okay, what are other opportunities that I can do in order to create impact and make a difference in what I do.
Great, thank you very much. We unfortunately we have run out of time. This was a great conversation, Michelle. Thank you, Adriana, as well, for all of information. It seems like you're doing something similar to what we are trying to do. So let's connect. Let's see what we can put our heads together. I think that there is a big interest in these topics here in the alumni community. Thank you very much for all the participants. Please stay alert for future events. We hope to run these sort of conversations periodically. Any last comments from Michelle, from Matthew, from anybody?
I just want to say thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, Diego, for connecting us with Michelle and for keeping us whole. So thank you very much.